So what was the experience of the average soldier in the Union and Confederate Army? You probably understand this, sir. Well, it was really, for the most part, it was a very, very challenging experience. Most of the men that served in the Union and the South had never traveled beyond their hometown. So myself, actually, I was born in Sweden. My parents came to the United States, but I had never traveled outside of Vasa, Minnesota, just outside of Red Wing until the Civil War began. And so men from around the nation, again, about 2 million men in the Union and about 1 million men in the Confederate over the entire 4 years of the war. It was very challenging. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a lieutenant in the Union forces, said, "We have shared the incommunicable experience of war. We have felt, we still feel the passion of life to its top. In our youth, our hearts were touched with fire." So for a Civil War combat soldier, the war was 99% boredom, sitting around waiting, drilling, marching, going someplace, and hard work. Marching was very, very challenging. It was probably one of the most challenging things we did. So for the Battle of Gettysburg, the 1st Minnesota, we were still down in Maryland on July 1st. This seems to be going in and out. So we were down in Maryland, and we were told to arrive in the battlefield in Gettysburg. It was about 40 miles north of us. We marched all night long. We arrived at, I think it was like 8 o'clock on the morning of July 2nd, the day that we went into battle. And so we were exhausted, but we were all young men. You know, I'm a lot older now, but we were all young men. We had a lot of energy, and we were typically carrying maybe 75 pounds of weight. And it was very common as soldiers were marching, especially when they were marching to a battle, they would simply they were so exhausted, they would just take their packs off and just leave them on the side and take their guns with them. Unfortunately, as Union soldiers, we could often be resupplied, but for the Confederate soldiers, they just did not have the resources that we had. So music provided relief, comfort, entertainment, and diversion in the midst of the boredom. Here's some regimental bands, more regimental bands. This is a Zover band, Confederate string band. I showed you some of these already. Sleeping soldiers. Well, as soldiers, we love to sleep. And it was very common. So when, for instance, the 1st Minnesota Regiment, when we arrived at Gettysburg at 8 a.m. on July 2nd, and remember, we went into battles about 4 p.m. in the afternoon, we just sat down and we just all fell asleep. We had been marching all night long, and that was very common. Soldiers just being so exhausted, falling asleep and sleeping. Well, we're going to sing a little song here. This is a Southern song. And interestingly enough, the song talks about Braxton Bragg. And Braxton Bragg was a Confederate general, and he was not popular. In fact, his troops, they actually hated him. One of his soldiers came out with a book recently. It's called Company H. Sam Watkins, one of the best diaries of the war. And he was in Braxton Bragg's army. And the reason they hated Braxton Bragg is that he would put troops in the back. If any of the Confederate troops skedaddled, the troops in the back would shoot him. That's the kind of soldier he was, the kind of general he was. Anyways, we're going to sing this song. Cumberland Gap. Lay down, boys, take a little nap. Lay down, boys, take a little nap. Lay down, boys, take a little nap. 14 miles to the Cumberland Gap. September morning in 62. September morning in 62. September morning in 62. Morgan's Yankees all went through. Lay down, boys, take a little nap. Lay down, boys, take a little nap. Lay down, boys, take a little nap. 14 miles to the Cumberland Gap. Here we go, Braxton Bragg. Braxton Bragg and Rebel Band. Braxton Bragg and his rebel band. Braxton Bragg and his rebel band. He runs them Yankees out of Dixieland. One more time, lay down, boys.
Lay down, boys.
Lay down, boys. Take a little nap. Lay down, boys. Take a little nap. Lay down, boys. Take a little nap. 14 miles to the Cumberland Gap. 14 miles to the Cumberland Gap. 14 miles to the Cumberland Gap. Well, it was fun getting to know some of those Southern songs and getting to know some bluegrass. There's the words and wasn't able to show you. So one of the things that was very common for soldiers is leaving their sweethearts behind. And I understood that. I left my sweetheart Lena behind in Vasa. And how was that for you, Lena, when I was gone those 4 years? Actually, 3 years.
Well, it was really boring too. And I did a lot of knitting.
And the women in both the North and the South really supported the troops, you know, sending them packages. My wife sent me, she was my sweetheart at the time. She sent me letters almost every week that somehow arrived. She sent me cookies. She would send us stuff in the mail. So that was really nice. So there's some pictures of some men and their sweethearts. And we're going to sing the song In the Arms of Abraham. So this song is, this is an interesting story. This is a song from the perspective of a woman back home that her soldier was drafted. And the draft didn't begin in the Union Army until 1863. And just an aside, when the draft began in 1863, there were riots in New York City. They rioted in New York City. And that was in July of 1863. And so the 1st Minnesota, after we had served at Gettysburg and we were exhausted, we were commanded to go to New York City to put down the draft riots in New York City. That's where we were. But by the time we got there was about 10,000 troops. There was no battle going on. So this is a story of a woman and her experience leaving her experience with her loved one in the Army. We'll do this one. And then also the South wrote a similar song with a similar tune. They took the tune and they made a whole different song, so we'll do that second. Here we are, The Arms of Abraham. And I can see a little better now. Thank you. So now we're going to do the Southern version. So the Southerners took this. They didn't quite like the sentiment, and they turned it into a song, The Bonnie Blue Flag. So it's in a different key, but it's basically the same song. And I'm going to try using my alto horn on this. And so they take the song and they stole it, and they have completely different words for it. And strangely, the Southerners, they really had a hard time coming up with a flag. They really did. And they were Confederacy, they were revolting against the Union, and so they really saw as each state as sovereign, so they couldn't even decide together what their flag should look like. So during the Civil War, the South actually had 6 different flags that they used, and it wasn't until 1863 that they arrived at the flag that we're also familiar with. It's called the battle flag. And so that's why this song is about the Bonnie Blue Flag, which was actually the flag of South Carolina when the war began. Just had to explain that so you don't wonder why it's the Bonnie Blue Flag. All right, let's try this one. Notice the difference? Hurrah for Southern rights. And so that was, that was a very common thought. The Southerners, if you would ask them, why are you fighting? There's a story about some soldiers that met some Confederate soldiers that were prisoners. They met them at Gettysburg, and they said, what are you fighting for? And they said, we're fighting for our rats. I said, what? We're fighting for our rats. We're fighting. And they said, what are you talking about? We're fighting for our rights. It sounded like rats to the soldiers, but they were fighting for their rights. And, you know, we have to admit, folks, it was part of our Constitution. They actually did have the right to slavery, even though it was horribly wrong. Lincoln, he had many interesting quotes about slavery. He said, if you think slavery is so good, why don't you try it on yourself? If you like it so much. So anyways, let's do this song by, we're going to transition to some charges. So as I mentioned, the buglers had to learn 40 different songs, bugle songs. Here's the bugler's book. Did I see we had one bugler here in the back, somebody that plays bugle? So 40 different songs, and like I mentioned, most of the buglers were young men. In the fife and drum corps, there are 12-year-olds, and sometimes there's 8, 9, 10-year-olds. So they're practicing in camp over and over again to learn their different, learn the different bugle calls, and it was very challenging for them. And by the time when they reached about, you could actually fight as a soldier. You're supposed to be 18, but oftentimes the soldiers, the young boys, would serve in the drum and fife corps until they were 14, 15, and then they would take up arms, which they much rather wanted to do, which was, you know, very unfortunate because many of them were killed as a result. But let me do a couple of bugle calls. So here's the charge, and so this is on the battlefield, the charge. So imagine just a battlefield where there's literally, the Union Army was, of the Potomac was about 100 to 120,000 men. And the Army of Northern Virginia was typically about 75,000 men. And of course you don't encounter them all at once, you go by regiments. But it was just an incredible cacophony of noise, cannons and guns and going off and people screaming, officers screaming orders, and bugles being blared everywhere. And so the bugle was used because this was the only way to communicate on the battlefield. And there was bugle calls to charge, bugle calls to retreat, bugle calls to go to the left, bugle calls to go to the right. And so there's all different kinds of bugle calls. So every regiment, and a regiment is 1,000 men. As the war progressed, there was obviously less and less men. Like I mentioned, we had about 250 by the end of the war. Oh, there we go. Thanks,
There.
Dina.
Is that what you
Oh,
want?
I didn't go, thank you. I forgot to, so that's the flag that was adopted with the 13 stripes. So here's a good question for you. Why does the Confederate battle flag, why does it have 13 stripes? Remember I said that there was 11 states in the Confederacy? Why would it have 13? Because there was 2 border states, Missouri and Kentucky, that had shadow governments. And so both Missouri and Kentucky fought in the side of the North and the South. And one of the things that Lincoln tried so hard to do was to keep all of the border states in the Union. So there's a story about that. All right, I'm going to go forward here a little bit more. Let's see.
Keep going.
Brass bands became very popular. Got a lot of information here. So one of the reasons that the regimental bands were so popular during the Civil War is because brass bands just exploded in interest in the early 1800s. And when the war began, they didn't have enough instruments. Most of the instruments, brass instruments, came from England before the war began. But as the war began, there was just an incredible need for instruments. And so their manufacturers began manufacturing brass instruments in the Union. And that's, we still have them today. All right, I'm going to go forward. So here's some of the instruments. You can see how unusual they were. And many of them, these were made for marching. So a brass instrument for marching is a lot different than a brass instrument for a symphony orchestra. So you can see they have the barrels facing forward so they could march with them. And the bigger, stronger men would have the larger, heavier instruments. There's some buglers. Regimental bands and fife and drum bands. So the regimental bands were official Union Army bands used for marching ceremonies and often made of professional musicians. Here's another picture of a brass band. I got a lot of pictures, just want to show you here. Union Regimental Band. So there was over 2,000 regimental bands. About 75% of the regiments had bands. And fife and drum corps were called field music. Field music, which is different than the regimental bands. So here's the Union drum and fife, and you'll notice on these pictures of these soldiers that the average age is about 12 or younger. And the way you can tell that these are young men is they don't have beards. And I'll show you a lot of pictures here. You can see these soldiers, none of them have beards, so they're all teenagers or younger, drilling and practicing. One soldier explained how unprepared they were for battle at the very start of the war. So after that first battle of Bull Run, that was just a mess. Nobody knew what they were doing, even though the South really won that battle. They didn't know what they were doing either. But during that coming year, it says, we had never been drilled before. An untrained drum corps furnished us with music. Each musician kept different time, and each man in the regiment took a different step. We marched, ran, walked, galloped, and stood still in our vain endeavors to keep in step. It was very hard. And that was very much true in 1861. By the end of 1862, we started getting our act together. Notice how young these drummer boys are. Notice no beards on these young men. Soldiers weren't always adults. In fact, 1 in 5 soldiers during the war were under the age of 18. Child soldiers served important purposes, acting as messengers, scouts, drummers, musicians, and servants. So here's an interesting picture. So on your left here, we have a young boy who was a slave. And it was very common during the war that enslaved people, they left as the Union Army came, the enslaved people would rush to the Union Army. They called them contraband, and the Union Army didn't exactly know what to do with them. Eventually, they started serving right in the Union Army right after the Emancipation Proclamation. So on the left-hand side, you see a young boy as a slave, and here he is as a soldier, as a drummer boy. Isn't that an incredible transformation? And the same was true with soldiers. Here was some boy soldiers, and they fought side by side with one another. I think I'm coming to my my bugle calls here.
Where's the bugle call?
All right. So here's an interesting story. Here's a drummer boy named John Clem, also known as Johnny Shiloh. He fought in the Battle of Chickamauga, and Clem shot a Confederate officer even though he was only 11 years old at the time. And they made him a sergeant in the Union Army. Here's our buglers. They were the signal corps of the Civil War, and they were so essential on the battlefield. And that's why it was so important for these young boys to learn their bugle calls. They had to have them down. You do not want to be in the middle of a battle and your colonel tells you to give the charge, and instead you give the retreat. You do not want to be on a battlefield and your colonel says, sound the charge to go to the left, and instead you sound the charge to go to the right. So it was really an important, very, very important responsibility for these young kids, and they did an excellent job. All right, here we come to some bugle calls. Here's the charge. I'm not going to use my Civil War bugle because it's so hard to play. The charge. And then, of course, could have been done much faster. And often when the buglers were on, it was common for drums to be there. So, Jeannie, if you want to, actually, don't play for this one. This is the Reveille, which is, actually, this is morning. You don't have to play for this one. All right. Let me do, you know what, I'm going to do dinner call. So there was bugle calls for everything. And probably some of the most hated people actually in a Union camp were the buglers. Because they were always sounding their buglers, always noise going all throughout the day. So this was the dinner call that they would be listening to. And the soldiers called it roast beef. Roast beef, come and get it. All right, let's continue on here. So here's this is a an artist's conception of the 1st Minnesota on July 2nd. So a battlefield was a horrible cacophony of ear-splitting noise, men screaming and shouting, moaning, guns, cannons. It was really, it's the kind of sound and noise that few people forget. And then of course we had the rebel yell. I don't know what it was about those Rebs, but when they went into battle, I think it was just their way to get over the fear. They came into battle just screaming at the top of their lungs as they charged. And even at Gettysburg on Pickett's charge. So remember I mentioned that we were, July 2nd, we did that charge against the Alabamians. So there was actually about 47 of us men from the 1st Minnesota that survived. And so we were placed, our commanding general Hancock, he said, I'm going to put you in a really safe place right in the middle of the battlefield for July 3rd. Well, guess what? That's where Pickett's charge was. And we were there right in the middle of that as they came across that mile-long path. 12,000 Union, or I should say rebel troops, and being cut down as they can, being enfiladed from all sides. And so only a few made it over the wall, and we were there with them. Combat soldiers never forget the horrific noise of death and suffering. So we got the Emancipation Proclamation that was signed that set the slaves free as of January 1st, and 180,000 black soldiers served in the Army, served with distinction. Frederick Douglass gave an address to the 29th Confederate Volunteers. This is what he said to them. With the United States cap on your head, the United States eagle on your belt, the United States musket on your shoulder, not all the powers of darkness can prevent you from becoming an American citizen. And not for yourselves alone are you marshaled. You are pioneers. On you depends the destiny of 4 millions of the colored race in this country. If you rise and flourish, we shall rise and flourish. If you win freedom and citizenship, we shall share your freedom and your citizenship. Well, those 180,000 black troops, they served with great honor and great distinction. And actually, for many people, including Lincoln, it really changed their attitude and their minds about people of color, African people of black Africans. Totally changed their perspectives. So here's the casualties of war. During the war, it was estimated that someplace around 620,000 men were killed. And more accurate, it was probably up to more like 1 million. It's very common for soldiers to be wounded in action and then for their family to come and get them and take them home. You know, much of the battle took place around Maryland and Virginia and Pennsylvania. So it's very common for soldiers' families to come and take them home, and many of them died at home. And sometimes we lost sight of them, the statistics. So 2% of the population of the USA died in the war. You can see the casualties there. 18 to 20% of all Southern men were killed in the Civil War. Isn't that astounding? Here's some pictures of death. I'm actually going to be giving a talk this afternoon at the Lyon County.
This evening.
Is this at 5 o'clock? 5 o'clock this afternoon?
That's an evening.
Okay, evening. 5 o'clock in the evening. Thanks, Lena. On the photography of the Civil War. And Matthew Bradley was one of the main photographers. There's many other photographers, but he went to the battlefield and he was there at Gettysburg. I think he arrived like July 5th and started taking pictures on the battle. And what Brady did, and many other photographers, they sent their photographs of the dead soldiers to the newspapers, Harper's Weekly and all the other newspapers. And so for the first time, people were seeing the reality in photographs. Photography really just began in the 1840s. And so they could see it. So music brought a small degree of relief and humanity. So we're moving on to another song here. So it was very common, 10 cities. So the Army of the Potomac was at any given time 100 to 120,000 men. Can you imagine all the tents that would take? Can you imagine all the food that would take? And fortunately, we had the resources in the north that they did not have in the south. Oftentimes, Southern soldiers, they looked like scarecrows. They were really starved to death. So this next song we're going to sing, this is an encampment after a battle. And it wasn't uncommon for when a battle occurred for the attacking soldiers to go right through your encampment, or maybe even retreating, going right through your encampment. So for instance, the Battle of Shiloh in the summer of 1862, the Confederate troops went right through the Union forces. They went right through their tents, and that's what it looked like afterwards. So Tenting Tonight on the Old Campground was composed in 1862, and it sings the song about expressing what it was like to be, I'm going to read it. It's a soldier's song that honestly expresses the war and the death weariness of the soldiers. Became a popular song in both the North and the South. So we're going to sing this song for you.
Honey, how long are we supposed to go?
Say it again.
It's been an hour.
Yeah. We are tenting tonight on the old campground. Give us a song to cheer our weary hearts, the song of home and friends we love so dear. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the war to cease. Many are the hearts looking for the ride to see the dawn of peace. Tenting tonight, tenting tonight, tenting on the old campground. Tenting tonight, tenting tonight, tenting on the old campground. One more verse. Notice the honesty in these songs. It really expresses the heart, the sorrow, and the pain of the soldiers. We've been fighting tonight on the old campground. Many are lying near. Some are dead, some are dying. Many are in tears. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the war to cease. Many are the hearts looking for the ride to see the dawn of peace. Dying tonight, dying tonight, dying on the old campground. Dying tonight, dying tonight, dying on the old campground. Well, notice the brutal honesty in that song. That's a soldier's song. And so they sang that both in the North and the South because the soldiers' experience in both the North and the South was pretty common. Well, folks, I think we're gonna skip forward a little bit here. This is going longer than I anticipated,
Yeah,
and I apologize.
You know, he used to be a pastor, and he's a little long-winded.
You know, I wanna do this song. This is to me, this is such an interesting song. See if I can find this one. Just Before the Battle, Mother. All right, here we're going to skip through some songs that sound familiar. Songs about Andersonville. There's a picture of a emancipated soldier that was at Andersonville. Tramp, Tramp, Tramp about Andersonville. We're going to keep going forward here. And that song about Andersonville, it actually became the song Jesus Loves the Little Children. All right, going to keep going forward. Appalachian bluegrass music. We won't do Dixie. Maybe we'll end with that later on. So harmonicas actually were invented. I haven't played it yet. I'll play it later. Harmonicas were actually invented in Germany, like in the early 1800s, 1840s, 1850s, 30s, 40s. And so they were very, very popular. Many soldiers had harmonicas during the Civil War. All right, let's see. We're going forward. Should we do Lorena? Okay, we're not going to do that one. Down by the riverside, you can see we had a lot of music here. I should have planned on several hours. Here it is. Okay, I want to do this song because this is a good example of what happens with music. So the first verse is written. So this was written by George Root. He was not a soldier. He wrote the first song. This first verse We're going to sing from the perspective of, well, a professional musician who really did not understand what it was like to be a soldier. All right? You know what I'm talking about? So the second verse, the Confederates, somehow, we don't know who, they took, so the second verse was written from the Confederate, by the Confederates, their perspective on the South, on the Northern troops. And quite frankly, the first couple of years of the war, the Rebs kept beating the North and Union troops in battle after battle, so the Rebs did not look kindly upon the Union forces. They thought they were a bunch of cowards. So this song, you're going to see in it, we're just going to do one or two more songs and we'll end here. We're getting kind of long in the mouth. There you go, dear.
Actually, it was from the perspective of a northerner.
Yep, and so the second verse we're going to do, and Jeannie, you can change to this, Lena, is it starts off just before the battle, mother, I was drinking Mountain Dew. Well, Mountain Dew, of course, was whiskey. Just before the battle, mother, I am thinking most of you. While upon the field we're watching, with the enemy in view, comrades brave around me lying, filled with thoughts of God and home. For well they know that on the morrow some will sleep beneath the sod. Farewell, mother, you may never press me to your breast again. But oh, you'll not forget me, mother, if I'm numbered with the slain. All right, here's a Confederate version. Just before the battle, mother, I was drinking Mountain Dew when I saw all the Rebs a-marching to the rear. I quickly flew where the stragglers were a-gathering, thinking of their home and wives. 'Twas not the Rebs we feared, dear mother, but for our own sweet precious lives. Fear not, mother, for you'll never see my name amongst the slain. For I'll lay down my gun forever and skedaddle home again. Yeah, those Southern troops, they kind of spoofed the Union troops in that song. Well, folks, I think we're going to end with one last song. We apologize that we went longer than we anticipated. We're going to go right to the last song, The Impact of the War. I already mentioned this. Battle of Fredericksburg. We're going to keep going here. Cold Harbor was a horrible battle. It was after this battle that it said that Grant was the one. This was during the Peninsula Campaign in 1864. He ordered Union troops to charge against Confederate forces, and something like 18,000 men were casualties. And he went back to his tent and he cried after that, and he said in his memoirs that was his biggest mistake as a general. And Ulysses S. Grant was a great general, very, very good general. All right, I'm going to keep going forward here. We just did that one. Worship services were very common, and the regimental bands played for those. And actually, there was great revivals that took place on the battlefields. And as I mentioned, I grew up as a Methodist. I was trained to be a Methodist pastor, ended up becoming a history teacher. But there was revivals across the United States. Methodist preachers starting Methodist churches in the North and the South. And so during the Civil War, there was many gatherings, worship gatherings, and many revivals. There was thousands and thousands of men that were baptized during the Civil War. All right, the North and South, they both said, surely God is on our side. They were both Christians. And our wonderful President Abraham Lincoln said, sir, my concern is not whether God is on our side. My greatest concern is to be on God's side. For God is always on the right. All right, we're going to go to the end here. Sherman's March to the Sea. We should have made this 2 talks altogether. The surrender of Richmond. And Lincoln goes walking down the streets of Richmond 2 days after the Confederate Army left with his little son. So, of course, our wonderful president was shot and killed on Good Friday, April 14th, died April 15th, 1865. And it was very, very sad for our nation. This is a review of the Grand Army Review. And on May 23rd and 25th, going down the streets of Washington, D.C., 145,000 Union soldiers celebrated. And at the very front of the march was the black soldiers. Those soldiers, many have been enslaved before, and now they were free. They marched at the very front. 50 regimental bands played. There was the reviewing box. Ulysses S. Grant was there. Grant was there also. Andrew Johnson, our new president. All right, we're going to end with When Johnny Comes Marching Home. So you can imagine the incredible joy at the end of the war as troops began arriving home across the nation. And Lena, you can play the drums on this one.
Oh, yeah.
When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer and the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out. We'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Do another verse. Get ready for the Jubilee, hurrah, hurrah. We'll give the heroes 3 times 3, hurrah, hurrah. The laurel wreath is ready now to place upon his loyal brow. We'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. And we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Well, folks, thank you so much for coming today. Really appreciate it. I know this has been you've been very patient. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, we'll be up here. I have a few artifacts over here you can take a look at. I actually have a musician's sword. So if you were an officer in like a regimental band, you would actually be given a sword. So I have one of those up there. So thank you for coming today, folks. God bless you.